It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Atwood, Chief Warrant Officer, United States Navy retired, and President of the South Florida Military Museum, for historical insight on today's significance.
Gracias, señor. Damas y caballeros, ladies and gentlemen, yo tengo poco oración, a small presentation. Recordamos de Guerra Mundial II, regarding the Second World War, y en punto de Ciudad de Miami y del Mar mismo, regarding the city of Miami and its environment, the ocean. Moses, could you put the first slide up? Of arms and of the man I sing is the first line of the Roman epic, the Aeneid. So boiling it down to everyday English, about the war is what I will speak. Can that be brightened up some? It concerns primarily geography and military geography and the place of Florida within it. Second slide. It's a watery realm. Florida has 4 main sea passages that are critical to human civilization. Those are the Florida Straits, a superhighway 5 miles away, the Yucatan Passage, the Panama Canal, by which people from one half of the planet get to the other half. And did I mention the Mississippi River? All maritime traffic going into the heartland of the United States has to pass through the Mississippi River, a riparian system which goes all the way to Montana and to Canada. Conversely, all maritime traffic leaving the heartland must also, that's taking this riparian system, must exit through the Mississippi roads. Do we live in a strategic environment? Yes, we do. Next slide. And Florida and the Caribbean were critical to the defense of the United States in World War II, because what we knew, anybody with a map can figure it out. It's hard to see on the slide, but the commander-in-chief at the time in 1940, President Roosevelt, he rearranged things so that there were a system of 10 naval districts guarding the East Coast. The 7th Naval District, which became the illustrious 7th Coast Guard District, was Miami and the Caribbean, and known colloquially as the Gulf Sea frontier. Next slide. In addition to its maritime importance, there also was a very important aviation component to Florida, its place in the world, because in those days, aircraft did not have refueling. They could not cross the oceans. They had to do hop flights. They were propeller-driven. You could take the northern route if you were going to Europe, and that battled blizzards, Greenland, snows, ice. The other way was the long way, the South Atlantic route, and it started right here. And it went down, it bounced down through the Caribbean to Brazil, and then across at the Dakar Narrows, which today we might smile, but that crossing in 1940 was tremendous. It was almost 2,000 miles of blue water. And if you're in an aviation, a bomber or something, and you're off by 1 degree, you're not going to hit Africa. You're going to splash. Once you get to Africa, you keep going to the east. You cross Africa, you go to the Middle East, you reach India, and then At the end of your long aviation trek, you fly across the Himalaya mountains to China, who was a critical ally. The crossing of the Himalayas was known as crossing the hump, and all of that aviation activity started here. One of the places it started was Morrison Field, now known as West Palm Beach International Airport, and Miami Army Airfield. And people say, where did it go? It didn't go anywhere. They changed the name to Miami International Airport after the war was over. Next slide. You can say what you want about the enemy in 1940, but they were not stupid. The United States faced in 1940 a situation where the enemy could have gone down to West Africa, which we've already pointed out, and who controlled West Africa at that time? Vichy French. They could have crossed the Dakar Narrows, climbed up through the Caribbean, and landed on the sunny beaches of Daytona Beach and Miami Beach and all the others. So the situation was quite serious. Next slide. This is a slide, we're halfway, of President Roosevelt, smiling. We know he was jovial and a nice guy, and that. Next slide. That's the whole photograph. And this is because I said, of arms and the man I sing. Military leadership. This presentation multiplied with a quantum leap in time gets delivered regularly to undergraduates and students. And it's a little example of leadership. If you notice, Roosevelt, of course he's smiling. He's fishing. He liked to fish. He's the only American president that hunted sharks. And he hunted them from the fantail of a United States destroyer, sometimes a cruiser. And you see in the background the ship's company. I guarantee you, as a prior naval person, if the old man is on the deck, the crew is not going to be in T-shirts unless they know it's okay with the old man. And at the same time, though, he's got the officer of the deck still suited up in choker whites and probably uncomfortable as heck, but he's got the deck. A little example of leadership. Next slide. Okay, what we have here is the watery environment around Florida. It's a second look at what we discussed earlier, the maritime realm of Florida. Nice, clean, it's wonderful. Next slide. But the war came. That tank is driving down this street, the street that's right out there. That tank's on Flagler Street. You can tell because it's the Olympia Theater. Next slide. The U-boat war. The U-boat war is one of the two active campaigns of military operations in the Western Hemisphere in World War II. The other was the Aleutian Islands, which it's another story, but quite a big one. The U-boats came here because why? They could study the map. They go, wait a minute, the mouth of the Mississippi, the Florida Straits, duh. Next slide. That's the result. That's one of the ships. That's a freighter. It's on fire. It's aflame. It's floating off Key Largo. It floated off. It was hit amidships off Key Largo, and it floated all the way across the horizon to Fort Lauderdale from Key Largo until it finally went down. And during that time, of course, people took pictures. There were 98 ships sunk in this watery environment. Next slide. Every dot represents a ship that was sunk in 1942 and 1943. As you can see at the mouth of the Mississippi roads, quite a few of them, in the choke points we've looked at, where do you go if you want to sink targets? You go where the targets are. And that is the battle that we're talking about. A naval battle of incredible importance, because where do you think our oil came from in those days? It came from Texas, Texas tea. And at one point, the tankers full of oil were so damaged, it's the one thing that Winston Churchill said worried him. Without oil, you cannot do it. Next slide. Among other things, a quick shout out to the World War II guys. We don't honor you by mentioning you. You honor us by being here. And to all the people at the international community that has come here, in case you didn't know it, there was even a blimp was shot down by a U-boat. Tough customers. Last slide. Oh, next to last slide. There were more military people than civilians in Florida during the war because of the things we've just talked about, and also its space on the planet and its place. You can train for any kind of naval activity here, any kind of aviation activity, year-around, and almost every kind of ground forces training. Lots of beaches to practice D-Day on. It's where they did. As you can see, by the PT boat, it's right there in Biscayne Bay, which is a couple miles away. John Kennedy was one of the instructors of the PT boat school here. Like I said, there was a lot of schooling and a lot of training, and we'll talk about the Cuban Navy. But I just want, and by the way, Kennedy was here because he had been wounded in the Solomons, and he had to wait in line to get back surgery. So he rode a desk here in Miami for 6 weeks. Next slide. So the takeaways from this are that it was a dire time, a critically important time. I don't think there's anyone other than the few blessed elderly here who have experienced what von Clausewitz would call a total war. But it did take place, and Miami, South Florida, and the Caribbean were a critically important campaign. This last slide, it just shows you that these are sectors of patrol by airships. You wonder why there's an airship station of Goodyear in Pompano? It's a vestige. There were airships up in the sky 24/7 for years on patrol. And if you can see, right smack dab in the middle is the haven and the island of Cuba. And that's another topic. That's where we're headed. So I thank you, and it's an honor to be here. That is all.
Thank you, Dr. Atwood. Would you please come back up to the podium for a presentation? I would now like to invite Mr. Jochen Vern up to the podium to present the Global Offshore Sailing Team's Expedition 176 flag to Dr. Atwood. On Expedition 176, the team visited the site of the battle between the CS-13 and U-176 off of Nuevitas, Cuba. They also unfurled this flag at the memorial in Cuba to merchant mariners lost in World War II. Mr. Vern will now present Dr. Atwood with that flag for display in the South Florida Military Museum. Thank you, Dr. Atwood and Mr. Verne. I would now like to call up State Representative Eric Friesen, as I understand he would like to present something to commemorate the history we just discussed. Representative Friesen.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you all for being out here. I wanted to make sure that as the great city of Miami, my dear friend Mayor Tomás Regalado was commemorating the incredible bravery and historical relevance of the gentlemen that are here in the front row, and all the Cuban men that fought during the World War II for the freedom of the United States and the freedom for the world and the fight against tyranny. That the state of Florida also recognized the incredible valiant efforts of these men. So what we have here is a brief tribute from the state of Florida recognizing the 72nd anniversary of these men's fight, and everything that you've heard historically, obviously from Dr. Atwood, is jointly commemorated with the city of Miami, and the state of Florida is proud to recognize these incredibly courageous men who, quite frankly, and I was talking to Lieutenant Colonel Colmenares earlier, until a good friend of mine whose grandfather's being recognized here today told me about this honor. I really didn't know the historical participation of the Cuban Navy and how entrenched they were in the American and the Allied fight against the Axis powers and making sure that we preserve freedom. And it just reminded me, as Mayor Regalado said, that the one consistent truth of the Cuban people, regardless of any rewrites or attempts at rewriting of Cuban history, is that they have always stood for the fight of freedom and the fight against tyranny in the world. So I commend everybody here. I was going to say a few words in Spanish, but Dr. Atwood's Spanish intimidated me a little bit. Pero esto es un breve homenaje para todos los soldados y para el esfuerzo valiente que hicieron estos hombres en la lucha contra la tiranía y para preservar lo que es la democracia y la libertad en el país y en el mundo. Así que un breve homenaje para todo el mundo del estado de la Florida. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Representative Friesen.